Hello and welcome to this video on the FEV of Fallout. FEV is effectively the Fallout version of CRISPR, just more powerful, more big, more green, more angry, and a lot less ethical. While we won't say that FEV is real, it is far closer to reality than it is to fiction at this point in time, at least by contrast when it was first announced in the original Fallout games. FEV is an acronym and stands for Forced Evolutionary Virus, and no, we won't say that entire name the entire way through this video, it's just too much hassle. This is a highly questionable, if not arguably unethical product created by Westtech prior to the nuclear apocalypse. It has the ability to force changes in both the genotype and phenotype of organic beings, along with a relatively easy modification of that genome for whatever purpose. Because it is so, let's say, easy to use, it was one of the most important developments in biological warfare on Earth at the time, and was sought after by both organizations before, during, and after the nuclear apocalypse. Unlike a lot of other Fallout lore, there is actually a fair amount of material we can work with, so to begin, let's go over the known features, functions, and important aspects of FEV. This is a general overview of what the wiki tells us about FEV, and work towards it, with it, and after the bombs dropped, to finally understand how real it can be, and what the limitations of it, as it's both shown and based on real-world science, are. The Forced Evolutionary Virus is a megavirus. This is likely a very poorly recognized giant virus, which is a virus with more than 300,000 base pairs in their genome. Essentially incredibly large and long genome sequences, far beyond what any other virus has, although perhaps they're also referencing the way this, let's say, biological weapon works, rather than the fact that it's actually a virus, as we'll explain eventually. As with most viruses, they are transmissible through direct contact or injection, and sometimes these are the same thing. It depends on what kind of bite you get. It can also infect individuals through airborne transmission, sometimes through another infected individual, although in most cases it's not going to be done that way. Instead, it's direct exposure from essentially a pure source. This pure source is often seen in the form of giant vats filled with a green liquid, but it can be aerosolized and used that way, or similar, say, injectable things. It has a interesting structure. Supposedly it's a strong structure with a protein sheath reinforced by ionized hydrogen, allowing it to absorb neutrons without being radioactive, making it immune to radiation. We'll deal with that in due course too. That one's an interesting claim. The purpose of the virus is supposedly to correct the host DNA by creating a theoretically specified result. This is also described as a better specimen, depending on exactly what it is you're trying to achieve. Because the FEV is a shifting absorptive virus, it copies DNA patterns. The claim is that it's not unlike RNA, but that's not how RNA exactly works, but again, due course, we're still focusing on the wiki for now. It stores them in exons and recombines them with the FEV, and because the FEV is pre-programmed with the correct DNA sequence, it allows for the overriding of what is already in the DNA, that is the host's existing genome, and allow it to basically create a replacement DNA sequence. This should correct anything or modify anything they're trying to change. The FEV itself has its own recursive code, which honestly sounds like coding nonsense, not genomics nonsense, but the resulting genetic code is essentially, though, re-injected into the host cell in the normal viral vector mechanisms for integration, and this allows for the generation of DNA, or the insertion and overwriting of DNA as it is there now. While the process is theoretically sound, FEV does at least partially rely on the host DNA and includes portions of its code when re-injecting itself into the cell, and this can cause off-target effects. The effects will also depend considerably on the method of exposure, and certainly the dose or level of exposure. Since FEV doesn't seem to be able to replicate within the host's body, and this is one reason why we're critical of it being a virus, it has a limited effect, especially based on the dose, sample, or exposure. This is why, let's say, super mutants, which are an icon of FEV, were either essentially pure strain humans as they're described, exposed to an extreme overdose of FEV, and that basically involves dunking them into a vat full of it, and almost drowning them if they survive. And in the other instance, it can occur through long-term, very low-level exposures to FEV concentrations. This is what led to the second generation of super mutants. The other option that's not quite either of these but sort of similar is direct injections, but these are more targeted along the lines of the first route, that is essentially excessive doses, because what you do is get a controlled mutation in a given area. The Master used this to some extent in being able to induce psychic abilities by injecting FEV directly into various parts of the brain. Then again, the Master is an amorphous tentacle blob, so if we want to still consider him a human, or it at this point a human, well, that's a very different story. One of the key things we've touched on, and one of the things that is very important to FEV, is that you need someone who is genetically viable, because if the individual is not administered with FEV and isn't viable, there's a good chance they'll die. If they are, it will rewrite portions of the host DNA, and this will then cause mutation. In some instances, completely rewriting whole sections of the DNA, and this will lead to the FEV almost being able to be made more similar to a virus inside the host, but also exhibiting many of the effects inside the host that are seen outside the host. A big, green and angry is the general sort of outcome. This process is nearly always extremely painful and extremely deadly, depending on the level and method of exposure. Some different strains of FEV, as there are a few that have developed over the years, will cause both extreme pain and body deformation upon overdose or long-term exposure. Others just cause rapid physical change in short periods of time, but also incredible pain, meaning that if you don't have the mental strength to resist it, the damage is serious. In, as mentioned, non-viable individuals, for example, those who have been exposed to a different strain of FEV, those who've been exposed to radiation already and had a number of mutations in their body, or similar, the outcomes are very, very negative, and nearly always death. Death is not done in a pretty way either. It's not the usual, oh, you gradually get sick and sicker and sicker and die. No, it's you have the growth patterns, essentially cancer, but cancer that occurs very quickly, which starts with all of your body systems, challenging organs eventually, and then, well, you die by exploding into a meat blob, if you're lucky. If you're not so lucky, you die like one of Seralini's rats, cancerous growths being everywhere, and you're barely holding on to life, while you struggle wishing for death. The actual effects of FEV largely depend on what DNA is programmed into the FEV though, and it is an important distinction to make. Not all FEV is equal, some is more equal than others, and it is highly modifiable by design. The initial design was only focused on creating super soldiers, and you could think of this as being a general purpose mutation vector for that. The Master's modified FEV2 was only able to bind with human glycoproteins, and the Enclave used that in turn in creating curling 13. So you can see how there are multiple generations as they've been modified, or perhaps it's better to say multiple subvariants as the original was heavily modified. One of the things curling 13 did was create a potent toxin that would exclusively target humans, mutated or not, and kill them. In other instances, there have been attempts to use it more specifically, such as Frank Horrigan, to create walking monstrosities that are effectively super soldiers, just super soldiers that less soldier and more trained killer. Of course, we then also have other attempts that are more egalitarian, for example, reducing giant ants to their original size, but this didn't really work and ended up being more of a disaster than was originally there. One thing you'll see with just about every instance of FEV is that cells continue to grow. That is, FEV causes constant regeneration and certainly changes to cell DNA, causing the cells to not only multiply in number, but often get bigger themselves, leading to both hypertrophy and an increase in the basic cell count. These two distinct events, and there are proper words for both, but we'll stick with making this easy for now, means you have bigger cells and more big cells. Admittedly, how fast this happens and for how long after that initial mutation does vary, but it's generally accepted that in humans, mitosis rate is about 15% faster in super mutants, and therefore they have a longer lifespan. That is, more years in which to suffer. It is thought, let's say, that FEV can practically grant immortality to a living organism, although this is more a case of how FEV works rather than actual real immortality. Because FEV ensures that DNA constantly maintains a specified sequence, and assuming the FEV is as claimed basically immune to radiation, it will always ensure that your DNA is exactly how it should be. No mutations are required, and they're not maintained, you don't have issues around cellular aging. This would be what immortality is, which is still immortality of suffering. There's the question there, though, of how it prevents damage from ionizing radiation and genetic diseases, and, well, that is the thing. If it can do that, yes, you could theoretically be immune essentially to death, and, well, radiation damage, genetic diseases, mutations, etc. But that's a big if. There are, however, some major downsides to this, and the downside comes into one word: sterility. FEV, if it works as described, will misidentify any kind of gamete, that's sperm and ovum, as a damaged cell. It will do so for two simple reasons. First of all, if somehow or other it gets put into the ovum or sperm and finds its way into the combined DNA sequence with two distinct different parents, and therefore two distinct different genomes, suddenly you have two competing versions of the genome, and FEV basically says, well, neither of these is right, and destroys it. The other is rather more simple, that in isolation, that is as sperm or ovum, only half the genome is there, and therefore it is completely damaged, and FEV would have to repair that, leading to what should be a singular chromosomal genome sequence having been repaired to a complete dual sequence, allowing for the two chromosomes to be present, but that therefore prevents it from binding in and causing fertilization, thereby making any of these reproductive cells effectively completely sterile, or at least non-viable. That, of course, is somewhat, let's call it hypothetical, but that's only because it's not exactly clear if and or how FEV affects sperm, but, well, it is very clear based on the fact that the Masters' mutants were, for all intents and purposes, sterile, and this was one way to drive him crazy and cause him to self-destruct. And it should apply to any species with what is effectively a non-renewable pool of oocytes. That is ovum in the case of human females, but we would argue it should apply to sperm as well. This is why, even if spermatogenesis somehow was to be fixed in males, providing viable sperm, the sperm still wouldn't be able to merge with the ovum and therefore create, well, offspring. This is effectively the problem, though. It's not necessarily clearly and explicitly stated, but it does mean that you could arguably say that there are ways around this, but the ways around this are not really an answer to the problem. A cure to FEV was created by the Institute, and they do continue to experiment with both FEV and their cure after the Great War. Virgil is the only confirmed case of being able to treat FEV, although treat is used, or cure more accurately, in a very loose sense. It's not so much that he's cured so much as the transformation to a supermutant was reversed, and it's important to note that the difference here is subtle but important. The week-long process didn't fix his mutation so much as it changed his mutation from supermutant genes into human genes. This allowed for him to essentially be turned back into a human, but that's not the same thing as being cured. Secondary to that is it did leave notable changes in things like hairline, muscle mass, and so on. These are all somewhat telltale signs that the cure is not genome-wide and certainly not able to fix everything. This brings us to how realistic FEV is. And as we mentioned at the start of the video, it's a lot closer to reality than you might think at first. First of all, we have the idea of genetic engineering and retroviruses. Retroviral mechanisms are almost very similar in a way to FEV, as FEV is practically depicted as a retrovirus, which is something that will integrate into the host genome. For example, HIV will do this. What HIV does is have RNA that gets converted into DNA via reverse transcriptases, and then this gets integrated into the host genome. This is also used for some gene therapies now. No anti-vaxxers, the vaccines don't do that.
I will send you to Jesus.
That's not a thing. Instead, what we have is lentiviral vectors that are already using modified retroviruses to deliver the therapeutic genes for conditions like, say, spinal muscular atrophy and even certain cancers. If FEV were real, it could theoretically use a similar mechanism to introduce genes for enhanced traits. But you'll note there that we're talking practically singular or only a handful of genes at most. We then have the idea of targeted mutations, which is kind of the original idea behind FEV with the super soldiers. FEV could, in theory, target specific genes to enhance physical attributes. For example, the myostatin gene. This would help with regulating muscle growth, and inhibiting it in animals has produced significantly stronger and more muscular phenotypes. So, for example, do you want Beef Boy Soldier, or do you want Soy Boy Soldier? This would allow you to have Soy Boy Soldier turned into Beef Boy, and Beef Boy turned into the Hulk. A retrovirus could be engineered to do something similar, specifically talking about myostatin here. Radiation resistance is somewhat more difficult here, and it's one of the things we have as a problem specifically with FEV. Now, some organisms, such as radiodurans, have extreme radiation resistance, but this owes entirely to incredibly efficient DNA repair mechanisms. Without those, they have none of the immunity that they're essentially celebrated for. A retrovirus could theoretically introduce similar repair genes into a human, but the catch here is that integrating such a complex system across all the cells in the human body, or at that point in time mutant body, would be incredibly challenging and practically unrealistic. And of course, we then have to go back to the original issues of things like sterility, whether or not you're actually able to maintain the current genome and the modified genome you're trying to put in, and whether or not you can fix the differences between these two without some sort of catastrophic failure. Essentially, imagine what happens if you put a liberal and a conservative in a room together and give them a grey area to discuss. They're probably going to fight each other before long. That's what's going to happen if you try and put a modified gene and an original gene and some sort of mechanism that's meant to sustain one, the other, or both of these. They're going to fight. Then we have the rapid cellular transformation that occurs, remembering that FEV induces very quick physical changes. We're talking here things like muscle growth, skeletal alterations, and even gene expression. Now, it's true that gene expression can occur relatively quickly in a regular human, hours to days, but the difference between gene expression changing and actual physical transformations is huge. And typically speaking, physical transformations will take, let's say, weeks, if not months, and possibly years. And it's due to things like the cellular turnover rates and metabolic limits. Even if you increase the cellular turnover rate by just 15%, that's not going to take a month-long process and turn it into a few days. No matter what advanced gene editing tools are used, whether it's CRISPR or something else that will replace it in the future, you can accelerate the changes, but you can't change the actual physical changes. That will still take time, and a lot more time than what is being shown. Something that's a little more realistic is how the immune system and that manipulation could be seen here. The FEV in Fallout has to, at least to some extent, suppress or at least alter the immune system and how it responds to changes in the body, and particularly mutations. This is very similar to how modern immunotherapy techniques, such as the CAR T-cell therapies, work. What they do is they manipulate immune cells to try and target specific threats. But by contrast, what FEV would have to do is more or less include mechanisms telling them to either ignore specific threats, or at least significantly dampen the immune reaction and rejection of any changes that are in the body. This is sort of similar to how immunosuppressive drugs are used today. The only difference is that rather than having to have an injection or similar, your body just does it by itself. Admittedly, through use of genes and expressing those genes, but still. Now we have the major missing, or at least not possible things. We mentioned already the issue around instantaneous transformations. There is a simple biological limit. We've spoken about this in two contexts already. That is the ability to shapeshift like Mystique, and the ability to instantaneously regenerate parts of your body. The human body has a fairly, let's say, set upper limit in terms of cellular and metabolic processes, and none of these are anywhere near supporting the near instantaneous transformations FEV causes in any of the Fallout scenarios. For example, you can't go from being let's say, a 6 foot tall Adonis type figure into a, let's say, 9 foot tall hulking beast in a few hours. And let's be clear about it. We're saying that only in terms of you may be at the size of a very tall adult now and in the best possible fit condition, you still can't do this. Let alone if, say, for example, you're extremely elderly, you're infirm, or anything else. This applies just as much to things like muscle growth, bone restructuring, organ development. Everything requires time for cellular division, protein synthesis, tissue remodeling, and more. No matter how much you optimize gene editing, this is going to take weeks, months, and even longer again, and even if you were to try and somehow find a way to make that happen, the energy requirements would be ludicrous. The sheer amount of energy required and the sheer amount of raw materials required mean that the human body, and for that matter just about any other organism, that cannot make that happen. Not at scale, and definitely not at the speed that FEV is supposed to do so. The only way that could happen is, well, if the organism drops dead halfway through as they run out of materials to use, energy, and everything else, and they're just dead because the mutation failed, which might arguably be one way that FEV kills those who aren't genetically suitable. Next we have the universality of the genetic rewriting that's going on. We have no systemic delivery option available now. We have no foreseeable systemic delivery option. FEV is supposed to affect just about every cell in the body uniformly and almost simultaneously. The current gene therapies we have now struggle to achieve systemic delivery because of just retroviruses or nanoparticles, and they're only carrying 1 or 2 genes at a time, very small changes. The reason they can't make it is that they get cleared by the liver, the immune system, or get destroyed before reaching all of the tissues. Targeting every kind of cell, for example, we have connective tissues, you have things like muscle, bone, various organ tissues. All of these cannot be targeted with a single virus. It's just infeasible to do that. Every different kind of cell we're talking about has a different kind of cell receptor or combination of cell receptors, types, and so on. And then you have actual barriers in the body. For example, the blood-brain barrier. You have things in the lungs that are meant to prevent various pathogens from being able to get through very easily. So there are a lot of things that should prevent FEV from effectively being delivered the way it is. We then have the relative precision of what it does. FEV is supposed to cause consistent mutations in fallout. More or less you fall into one of a handful of categories. You either die because you're genetically unsuitable, or you get turned into a super mutant. And there are a couple of other options, but the majority of individuals who are successfully mutated and turn into giant green hulking beasts. Retroviral integration is effectively semi-random, and because of that, it will often target and hit unintended genes, disrupting their functionality. This will inevitably lead to unpredictable outcomes, cancer being the most common and most predictable, but, well, it's not the only thing. You could theoretically still have a semi-viable gene that's expressing a product, just not what it's meant to be expressing. This is in fact what happens with just about every mutation that occurs. Nearly every mutation is adverse to life, and this is both mutations in terms of those that are effectively facilitated by things like FEV or whatever other treatment, and those that occur randomly. They disrupt what the gene or whatever is meant to be doing and cause harm. Achieving a consistent and beneficial mutation not only across the population, at least in relative terms, and consistently is not just a monumental challenge, but something that frankly is beyond humanity at this point in time, and we would argue completely beyond the scope of what the Fallout universe can achieve. We then have to talk about the demonstrated cognitive trade-offs, perhaps that's the right word for it. Basically, big dumb green brutes, or similar. FEV is shown, at least over time, to have very much negatively affected intelligence. A reduction in intelligence for supermutants has gone down throughout multiple generations. Now, you could say that this is just genetic changes causing an impaired brain function, mostly things like, say, disrupting neural pathways or neurotransmitter production, but it seems to be consistent that intelligence goes down, physical strength goes up. You could also say, well, this is just game balancing, but Well, game balancing, it doesn't really work for science. It's not like you go into a laboratory and say, today I am going to make this, let's say, rodent have a greater susceptibility to cancer, but it will be much smarter. That would be a very dark and very depressing version of Pinky in the Brain. It's also true that intelligence is not just limited to a handful of genes, so it's not something you can easily, reliably, and consistently switch off to decrease cognitive function while also simultaneously hitting all the right buttons to increase physical strength and similar. Of course, on top of that, we have things like the brain's complexity, environmental factors, and so on. This is beyond not just, in terms of the precision of editing, but just beyond any capabilities for the knowledge we have at the moment. We then have sterility issues. FEV, as mentioned, should be rendering just about every individual, subject, or whatever you wish to call them, sterile. And this would therefore cause massive problems around the reproductive cells. We have a very simple example. You have your donkey and you have a horse. Crossbreed them and you get a mule. This mule is sterile. Obviously, a very simple example, but that's what you have here with FEV. Except with FEV, rather than crossbreeding, you've just gone to a donkey or a horse, injected it, made it stronger, but also dumber and sterile. Next we have radiation as a catalyst, and this is particularly important in the Fallout universe, where radiation exposure is basically universal. Radiation exposure will notably influence FEV's effects, and to be blunt about it, its success rate. One problem we have is that, radiation will cause random DNA damage. It's not going to be consistent, directed, or reliable, but FEV apparently requires someone just not be exposed to radiation, which doesn't make a lot of sense because we're not talking about the same damage in everybody. Unless FEV has a very, very specific, very, very large template, and it has to match exactly, that doesn't really work. We also have the fact that high radiation doses would be more likely to cause cell death and cancer, and not going to affect, say, a virus's ability to create human, in this case, superhuman and mutant traits. So the idea that radiation might be a trigger is just scientifically impossible. And of course there are certain ethical and practical considerations, but considering some of the shit that the Vault-Tec, West-Tec, and so on got up to in the Fallout universe, ethics and practical considerations probably not a major factor to consider. In short, the current scientific gaps we have now are obviously delivery systems, as we lack vectors capable of not only safely but uniformly editing every cell in a living human, and most gene therapies are only targeting specific tissues and or singular genes. We have certain, let's say, up-and-coming treatments. For example, there are capsids which can be used to enhance tissue specificity and reduce immunogenicity, thereby meaning that things will get to where they need to go more accurately and more reliably, but these are still relatively early on. We also have certain hybrid viral systems which use some of the advantages in terms of different viruses, but also the different kinds of, let's say, coatings or similar. We have lipid nanoparticles which are showing much greater promise, but again, a promise is very far from actually being into practice. They have been used, for example, with mRNA vaccines, and could be optimized for gene editing tools. And it's important to point out that although, yes, they do provide a greater tissue specificity and the ability to escape the immune system to a greater extent, they're still not there yet, and certainly not to a variety of cell types. You have certain exosomes that are slightly more promising in that respect, in that they can be engineered to carry gene editing machinery, and this would allow for the exosomes derived from specific cell types to be tailored for tissue-specific, essentially homing. They will track in and dock to their specific kind of tissue or cell, which greatly increases biocompatibility and reduces immunological risks, but reduces the, let's say, diversity of targets. We then have cell-penetrating peptides, which essentially are just conjugating gene tools that can be used to facilitate direct cellular entry, but not so great on a larger scale. Systemic delivery optimization would require very broad tropism. That is to say, it would have to find a whole bunch of ways into every different kind of cell out there, and this would also require it to be able to pass through a whole bunch of biological barriers. And although there are a lot of promising candidates, none of them have yet to be truly effective on large scale. We have, say, localized delivery, which might be a little bit better, and that would be somewhat more consistent with the in-universe law, where, say, the master used direct, say, brain injections of FEV to do certain things, and that would certainly help in editing certain genes, gene products, or cells that could then have an effect on the whole body, but that's still not there. Slightly more, let's say, possible, although this time purely in terms of getting to the deeper tissues within the body, which would require a laboratory setting rather than exposure in the wild, so to say, is ultrasound or magnetic guidance, wherein you use either ultrasounds or magnetic fields to guide the nanoparticles to the specific tissues, typically speaking deep within the body. So for example, if you want to get a precise dose of it to somewhere within the body and uniformly there, this works extremely well. We then have issues around the complex trait engineering. To be blunt about it, FEV has a whole raft of things it has to be carrying, and none of the current things that are out there that we have developed in terms of genetic engineering or trait engineering and anything else are anywhere near that level. We are incredibly far from being able to understand how to orchestrate these kinds of changes without a raft of other commensurate issues, mostly from unintended consequences, coming up. It's not to say we're not trying. You have things like high-capacity CRISPR arrays, which are an attempt to do that. You have synthetic viral vectors, which are mostly viruses being built from the ground up with the intention of doing something relatively similar. You have the idea of nanoparticle swarms, which is more or less exactly what it says. You have programmable nanoparticle swarms that navigate the body to deliver specific editing tools to specific tissues. And this would allow for the prioritization of certain cells, specific or critical to a given trait or outcome that you're after. With all of that, though, we need to talk about how you would even sustain such a reaction in the end. And sustaining it's a lot harder. You need some sort of feedback mechanism that will control the FEV and tell it, now you need to be turned on, and now you need to work, or now you need to be turned off and stop doing stuff, or at least slow down a lot. There are some gene editing systems of feedback loops that could monitor the cellular states, and this would adjust the editing activity in real time to maintain a certain desired result. It's possible that FEV uses something similar. So for example, you have temporal editing strategies, which are inducible promoters or very small molecular triggers that activate the editing process in FEV when required. This allows for a relatively quick and easy on-off switch, for example, increasing immune function during an infection, or more likely in this case, telling the body that there's been an injury, grow more muscle. You have reversible editing tools, which are somewhat necessary for virtuals to be trusted, and these are tools that would reverse the editing if there is an undesired effect present, which we definitely don't think FEV has. But that's an option because it could be an RNA-based editor or even epigenetic modifiers that can be, let's say, deactivated with very specific instructions. Long-term, stability is a big issue. Edited genes can be silenced over time, whether it's via epigenetic regulation or something else. And so you need to look at it in those terms. FEV being so stable or unpredictable is very unrealistic without something like this coming into play. And in order to make up for that, FEV would need some kind of real-time feedback and control, especially over genetic changes. Currently, any genetic modification within the laboratory requires not just a lot of work, but you also need to have a lot of effort, oftentimes weeks, to confirm that changes have been made and, to an extent, measure them. Another option would be somewhat more realistic, and that's something we could think, given the nature of what we see in the flight universe, that being the microbiome. There is the essentially bacteria and similar inside your GI tract. It's possible that they could be an indirect or a proxy measure of the kind of genes that are being expressed, and to a lesser extent the state of the individual organism. By using the microbes as a sort of biosensor, what they can do is effectively monitor the, say, host mRNA, protein production, metabolites, and similar. All these are typically linked to certain gene activity and expression. They would then in turn produce certain things that can be detected by the human body, for example, volatile compounds. This would allow for a certain feedback loop to be established and ensure that the genes are turned on and off as required, but it's possible that instead of that you could have something like, say, intracellular monitoring, but that's basically completely beyond the scope of anything that we have today and will have in the foreseeable future. You would need something like an artificial organelle, creating the synthetic organelle that would then live within the actual normal cells and monitor gene expression via various biosensors that are embedded within it. For example, RNA binding proteins or similar, and that would be useful in that it detects specific transcriptions and signals via whatever it is that it's trying to do, and then feeds back into the FEV. You then have RNA sensors, which would be RNA sensors that bind to certain transcriptions from the DNA, and this triggers a conformational change, which would be very specific, but also very temperamental. As anyone who's ever dealt with PCR would know, getting primers to work correctly and bond correctly and everything else can be not only temperature dependent, but very, very touchy and sensitive about what it is you do. A real-world FEV could theoretically exist as a retroviral gene therapy to enhance very specific traits like, say, muscle growth or DNA repair. It would use things like CRISPR or lentiviral vectors, but the rapid systemic and consistent transformation seen in Fallout are practically impossible, especially with current science due to the, well, to start with, biological limits. There's only so much in terms of cell turnover, energy demands, and the body's resources that they can throw at these things. There are technical barriers in terms of systemic delivery, precision of editing, and so on. And of course, just genetic mutations in general cause a lot of chaos, and we don't really see that ever. Radiation as a mutation catalyst is ridiculous, and of course, the only real common example of supermutants have a huge cognitive and physical trade-off that's not really reflective of what it's really like to have this kind of, let's say, modification or engineering event. This is not to say that significant advances in gene editing delivery systems and other biological processes wouldn't be possible, but they would be needed to approach even a very, very handicapped or limited version of what FEV is supposed to do. And this doesn't even touch on the ethics around this, and, well, we have doubts that anywhere outside of China, or we should say West Taiwan, would conduct such research, and it would be halted before it got even remotely close to finalization. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.